Complexity leadership theory did not arise because organizations wanted a more interesting story about leadership. It emerged because existing stories stopped working. Linear models built on prediction, control, and individual authority increasingly failed to explain what people were actually experiencing: persistent uncertainty, unintended consequences, and change that refused to behave itself. Complexity leadership theory begins from a more unsettling premise. Organizations are not controllable systems. They are complex, adaptive, and often unruly. A complex adaptive system is made up of many interacting agents, each responding to local conditions rather than central plans. Order emerges through interaction, not instruction. Patterns form without being designed. Outcomes cannot be reliably traced back to individual decisions or roles. Human organizations fit this description uncomfortably well. They are shaped by relationships, histories, informal power, and feedback loops that rarely align neatly with organizational charts. This reframing shifts leadership away from individuals and toward dynamics. Leadership is no longer something a person possesses or performs on behalf of others. It is something that happens in the space between people, often without permission, and sometimes in ways that unsettle those with formal authority. This is not a reassuring move. It removes the promise that clarity, alignment, or control can be permanently achieved. Complexity leadership theory draws on ideas from complexity science, particularly emergence, self-organization, and nonlinearity. Emergence refers to the way new ideas, practices, or identities arise, through interaction rather than design. Self-organization describes how coordination can form without central control. Nonlinearity reminds us that small actions can have disproportionate effects, while large interventions may change very little. Together, these ideas challenge the assumption that leadership operates through cause and effect. In this view, organizations are never finished. Stability is temporary and often local. Order and disorder coexist. Attempts to eliminate uncertainty tend to produce brittleness rather than resilience. Leadership, then, becomes less about resolving tension and more about working within it, often without knowing in advance which tensions matter most. One of the more useful contributions of complexity leadership theory is its focus on leadership functions rather than leadership types. It commonly describes three interacting forms of leadership activity: administrative, adaptive, and enabling. These are not roles or personalities. They are patterns of action that may be enacted by many people at once, often in conflict with one another. Administrative leadership refers to formal authority, structures, planning processes, metrics, and policies. It is essential for coordination, compliance, and continuity. It excels at efficiency and repetition. What it does poorly is deal with novelty. When administrative logic dominates, organizations become optimized for yesterday's problems. Adaptive leadership is where new responses emerge. It arises through interaction among people confronting problems that existing knowledge cannot solve. This work is informal, distributed, and frequently uncomfortable. It involves disagreement, experimentation, partial failure, and learning in real time. Adaptive leadership cannot be instructed into existence, and it rarely appears where people feel psychologically or politically unsafe. Enabling leadership sits uneasily between these two. Its role is not neutral facilitation. It involves actively shaping conditions so adaptive work can occur without being immediately shut down by administrative pressures. This means protecting certain conversations, legitimizing some forms of dissent, and translating emergent ideas into forms the formal system can tolerate. These are political acts. Someone decides whose experiments are protected, which risks are acceptable, and which voices are amplified or ignored. Power therefore sits at the center of complexity leadership, not at its edges. Power does not only reside in formal authority. It flows through narratives, norms, access to resources, and the ability to define what counts as legitimate knowledge. Administrative leadership does not suppress emergence by accident. It often does so because emergence threatens certainty, identity, and status. Complexity leadership theory sometimes underplays this reality, but practice does not allow that luxury. Learning under this lens is not something delivered through training or captured in best practice documents. It happens in the flow of work, through feedback, friction, and adaptation. It is local and contextual. This makes it harder to standardize and easier to ignore. Systems that claim to value learning often punish the very behaviors that make adaptive learning possible. Change accordingly looks different. Planned change assumes leaders can define a future state and move the organization toward it through implementation. Complexity leadership theory suggests that durable change emerges through iterative adjustment rather than grand design. Direction still matters, but it functions more like a set of constraints than a blueprint. Values, boundaries, incentives, and time horizons shape behavior far more reliably than slogans or targets. Constraints are not the enemy of emergence. they are its conditions. Poorly designed constraints produce compliance or rebellion. Thoughtful constraints channel energy without prescribing outcomes. Leadership becomes the practice of shaping these boundaries carefully, while remaining alert to how they interact in unexpected ways. Resistance is often cited as evidence of leadership failure. Complexity leadership theory treats resistance as information, but this is where the theory becomes uncomfortable. Not all resistance expands adaptive capacity. Some resistance protects existing privilege, identity, or fear. The challenge is not to eliminate resistance, but to discern which forms carry insight and which merely reinforce stagnation. This requires judgment, not neutrality. There is also no single system learning or adapting. Organizations are made up of overlapping systems with competing logics, values, and timeframes. What is adaptive for one group may be destabilizing for another. Emergence is plural and often contradictory. Complexity leadership theory does not resolve these contradictions, it exposes them. Critics are right to say that this work is demanding. Complexity leadership offers no clean playbook. It requires leaders to tolerate ambiguity, relinquish the fantasy of control, and remain accountable without being omniscient. It demands attention to emotion, identity, and power as much as process. It also demands restraint. Acting less, but with greater precision, often matters more than acting decisively. There is a temptation to turn complexity into a comforting narrative about participation and collaboration. That temptation should be resisted. Many organizations adopt the language of complexity while continuing to demand predictability, reassurance, and performance certainty. Complexity leadership theory does not reconcile that contradiction. It makes it visible. What it ultimately offers is not clarity, but honesty. It accepts organizations as living systems shaped by uncertainty, conflict, and uneven power. Leadership becomes less about standing above the system and more about staying in relationship with what is unfolding, even when that unfolding is incoherent, uncomfortable, or politically costly. That is not refinement, it is exposure.